right. Looks like the Avengers have assembled. Thank you all for being here. Joe doesn't get that reference. Okay, so let's jump into it. Thank you all for coming through. We have our Populous Roundtable, which is usually at 10 p.m. Eastern, but we're coming at you today at 9 p.m. Because we have special people here. I mean, we have special people every week, but, you know, some people are more special. First, I'll introduce Eucharist, who's been through here quite a few times. Eucharist, thank you for coming through once again and joining us. You've always a fantastic panelist to have.
Yeah, well, thank you for continuing to bring me back. I appreciate it. I'm excited.
Next, we have my main man. His name is Pisco. Pisco, thank you for coming through. Pisco, one of our all-time superstars. Pisco, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks. The weather is cold, but suffering through it, and looking forward to this conversation about judicial review and courts and other things. I'm sure that would interest a 3L.
Yeah, same here. I'm actually very, very excited to do this. I've been thinking about it all day. And we have to thank the next person for all this. His name is Spectre. Spectre, thank you for being here. Spectre, one of my mods, and the person who helps put together the Populous panel. Thank you once again, Spectre, for all the hard work that you've done. And yeah, tell the world about yourself.
Hey, I'm Spectre, formerly of Syndicalism. I stream on Twitch every now and then. Mostly I'm just on here yelling at people on the walk-on panels. So, I mean, you can probably just go ahead and follow Inceptor Prime and see more of me than by following me. That being said, if you are interested in learning about like how to start a co-op in America, despite the fact that you still have to file as an LLC or a nonprofit, then, you know, maybe do follow me because that's the kind of boring stuff that I talk about. So, yeah.
Gotcha. All right.
I'm also streaming Rust now, if you're into those memes. We're on a politics Rust server, which is just all kinds of chaos. Like, it's going how you'd expect. Internax is LARPing and prep. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yes. Okay. Next, we have someone who my channel is very familiar with, Joe, the Silly Serious. Hey, Joe. How are you? Once again.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good.
I've been super psyched to have Joe here. I think Joe. Actually, I think you're the only the second woman to actually be on this particular panel. So coming through a shattered ceiling. Thank you for coming. For spending some time. I know you're very busy, but you're here with us, and we very much appreciate that.
No, it's exciting. I like the topics.
Okay, great. Last but not least, the man, the myth, the legend. We have Ben Burgess. Ben Burgess, back again. We had him here many moons ago. And we had a good time getting to know Ben Burgess there. Our good friend Spectre managed to convince him to come back. I don't know. I'm guessing some money was exchanged. But Ben, thank you for appearing once again on my channel. Thank you for dressing up for the occasion.
Ben, make sure to unmute yourself on Discord and not
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, as you can tell, you know, I spent a lot of time in front of the mirror, you know, holding up different sweatshirts, deciding which one I put on for this. But no, this is looking forward to it. Thank you for having me back.
All right. So let's jump into it. The first topic is on judicial review. We got our resident legal beagle, soon to become an eagle, Pisco, ready to go on this one, I'm sure. But yeah, we're talking about should the left push to abolish judicial review? I'll just start with that. What do you all think? Why don't we start with Pisco, because I know he's ready to go.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that judicial review is an important mechanism of our federal judiciary. And in fact, state judiciaries and state court systems have their own judicial review of state laws as well. What should be clear, I think, for everybody, is that any act or legislation or statute that violates the Constitution is not really a valid statute. So the question that we have is, how do we address the problem of a statute or an executive action or an agency action that violates the Constitution? To whom do you delegate the power to render that act, or in this case, judicial review would be an act, a nullity. One answer is you might embody that power into the legislature themselves, but there's an obvious conflict of interest, I think, which is a legislature that just passed a law has a bias in favor of that law, presumably. Therefore, I think it's important to recognize, as the framers did, that power should be embodied somewhere else, in an independent judiciary that's there with life tenure, that whose salary cannot be decreased by the legislature, and an attempt to, as best you can, prevent unconstitutional acts from being passed. So that more or less is the reason why we have judicial review. A lot of people on the left don't like it because of the politics surrounding it, because oftentimes acts that we consider to be good are struck down by federal courts. You should try, I think, in your head, when you're devising a strategy for the structure of the government or of the court system, to put politics out of it and have a neutral guiding principle, I think, for what would be a good rule before you introduce the politics to it. Because judicial review has helped us sometimes as well. For instance, gay marriage and abortion. Those are acts that made state laws unconstitutional as against the federal constitution. So be careful about presuming that judicial review always favors conservatives, because it doesn't.
Okay.
Well,
why don't we just do like a opening statements for everyone, and then we'll jump into it. Eucharist.
Yeah, I mean, that was very intelligent. Honestly, like I just, my default position is like, this seems like a fine thing that we have, although obviously like it, we all have, I'm sure, court cases we could pull up that we really disagree with and dislike. Like we could fight about particulars, but I mean, yeah, as described, like I like the concept. It's the utility is there. Like it seems like we have to have a mechanism of striking down laws that go against some sort of foundational principle. And I'm not really sure how you do it better. And on the final point, I guess this is really all I have to say, is that like I think it is kind of a myth that it does generally favor conservatives. Yes, it is. Like the Supreme Court and the fact that we rely on precedent is in some sense like definitionally a conservative institution. The fact that like we make decisions based on prior cases, though not always, right? We overturn decisions all the time, is inherently like conservative in some way. But I'm going to try to find the article so I can post it in the chat. But I remember reading this article a couple of years ago by somebody basically just taking stock of judicial appointments, which, everybody knows there's been some like conservative slant on that. The number of like Federalist Society members who get appointed to federal judiciary and to the Supreme Court is pretty high. But then looking at the actual progress in particular directions, it doesn't actually, it appears that there's been more of like a general leftward trend rather than any like overcompensation to the right. So I would just like, if the problem you see with it is that like conservative politics are coming through on the court, I would just like, we could maybe hash that out. But
Okay. Spectre.
Right. So I don't know. There's definitely a few things that Pisco brought up that I don't necessarily have an answer for, and that he's brought up over the last few months that me and him have kind of gone like back and forth off and on talking about this that I don't have an answer for. That being said, the idea that the framers' intention was for the court to perform judicial review, I don't necessarily agree with that. I believe that that's a power that the court gave to itself when it ruled on Marbury v. Madison, which is ironic that you would bring up Congress, ruling on its own laws and giving itself, extra power when that's pretty much what the Supreme Court did. I don't know. As far as I can tell right now, yes, judicial review in the past has gotten the left things at once, like the gay marriage meme, all the rest of the things that Pisco brought up. But as the Supreme Court is structured right now, I don't think that they're going to be making any like great forward leaps for the LGBTQ community in the next, 30 years or so. So as a pragmatist, don't really give a fuck. The only other solution that I've heard at this point is that we should counterpack the courts. And when people give me the pushback of, well, aren't they just going to counterpack back and then them counterpack back? And then 40 years, the situation is so absurd that we just abolish judicial review anyway. And just feels a little obtuse. I don't know.
Okay. Oh man, we're gonna have fun with this topic, I think. Joe, this is really serious.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I don't agree with Pisco at all. I think there is an extreme lie that's sort of sold to us about the progressive promise of the Supreme Court. Every case you bring up in terms of Roe v. Wade, Brown v. Board, Obergefell, that is the result of actual, like the institution of the Supreme Court has no teeth. It has no power to do that. Obergefell, gay marriage happens because of social movements which happened prior to the Supreme Court decision. After Brown v. Board, segregation didn't disappear overnight. I might be wrong, but last I checked, women throughout America do not have easy access to abortion despite Roe. So I think that most people, regardless of their political persuasion, can agree that the Supreme Court is not a democratic institution. It is an oligarchy. It is a caste of philosopher kings which impose their will on others. And it's interesting that the justification for such an anti-democratic institution is the protection of the democratic process itself. I think when we saw a shift on the left from socialism being the main ideology to liberalism, we sort of bought into this idea and lure of litigation, that it was easier to litigate, to prove through argument to other like-minded, liberal, wealthy elites that this was the right thing to do and this was the progressive thing to do, instead of organizing on the ground. And I think it's a real mistake, because without that social change, you won't get the legislative bodies pushing to actually enforce any laws that go through the Supreme Court. Furthermore, every part of the law which the Supreme Court claims to use to protect things such as individual rights or expand equality have been used by the Supreme Court more rigorously to silence dissidents and to entrench inequality than they have ever been used for progressive means. And I think that while I'm willing to perhaps permit this idea that history is not destiny, I think it is overselling entirely to suggest that there is any way that the court can be used more effectively for progressive change than it can be used to stymie progressive change.
Amazing. Dropping the mic once again. All right, let's go to Ben Burgess.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Spectre and Silly Serious. I think that I guess I don't get the argument that we should just sort of take politics out of it and thinking about the design of institutions, especially if part of the reason that we care about it is because we think that it'll protect the rights of vulnerable minorities. That's a political consideration. So I think that how the politics are actually going to play out is very relevant. I agree that Supreme Court decisions don't always favor conservatives, but I don't know who that's in response to, because I don't see anybody claiming that. I think that people I see who are critics on the left of judicial review, people like Samuel Moyn, I don't think they're saying that that it uniformly benefits conservatives. I think that what they are saying is that the kind of civics class understanding of what the Supreme Court does, that it's going to protect the rights of vulnerable minorities against democratic majorities, is I think the point that Silly Serious made is exactly right. I think the history is not really on the side of that claim. I think when we think it is, I think a big part of the problem is that we're thinking of one very specific chapter in the court's history. We're thinking basically of the Warren Court, Brown versus Board, Roe versus Wade, all that stuff, right? And so really we're talking about a few decades, really Warren Court, properly speaking, is even less than that, but a few decades in the late 20th century when it ruled the way that we liked a bunch of times. And then what we do essentially is we treat the vast majority of the history of the court as if it were some sort of aberration from that norm in the late 20th century. But that doesn't really make sense, right? I think if we look at the overall history of the court, it has not at all been consistently there to protect the rights of vulnerable minorities, oftentimes just the opposite. So, for example, a court has struck down attempts to have meaningful affirmative action, really defanged affirmative action laws, for example. And so I think that historically, the unpopular minority the Supreme Court has by far been the most likely to step in to protect has been rich people. That's what it was doing in the 1930s until FDR threatened to expand the court to block, to stop them from doing this. and then they backed off from it a little bit, and that was enough to kind of save the institution for the time being. And it's certainly what they were doing in the 19th century when they made up corporate personhood out of whole cloth and attributed it to the 14th Amendment. And I think thinking about that corporate personhood example, and we could multiply many, many, many recent decisions, Citizens United, etc., I think really gets to the problem, because in the abstract, you say, okay, sure, we have a constitution. I have a lot of problems, honestly, with the constitution that we have, but whatever. Let's say we're just thinking about the good parts of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights and all of that, and we don't want to have laws that violate it. So this is a way that we think of it almost like this is an automatic process. The legislature passes laws that violate the Constitution, and then that'll activate the Supreme Court like a home security system that that's tripped up when people go past a certain boundary. But of course, that's not actually the way it works. The Supreme Court is made up of human beings who are deeply political actors, and of course, as Specter quite rightly says, this has nothing to do with the Constitution. The power of judicial review is nowhere hinted at in the Constitution. That's something the court took for itself in Marbury versus Madison. But the way that in practice, the way it's been interpreted, that we give in the United States the Supreme Court the right to overturn any law that it likes as essentially a unelected lifetime appointment super legislature. Well, that doesn't actually guarantee that laws will be in line with the Constitution. That will guarantees that the laws will be in line with whatever Supreme Court justices think, which might or might not align with the Constitution. And more often than not, the Constitution, like the Bible, is often vague and open to interpretation. And so it's usually trivially easy to find arguments from the Constitution for whatever ruling you want to do, you want to have. There is a reason why these really controversial cases, these landmark rulings, tend to come down either on strict partisan lines or on something pretty close to it. Because if one is clearly a conservative ruling, you will come up with something in the wording of the Constitution to justify the conservative interpretation. If it's on the liberal side, you come up with something in the Constitution to justify that. And I think that, I guess the two things I'd say about this, and I'll leave off, are one, that when we talk about, oh my God, what would we have if we didn't have this? I think it's a little bit provincial. It reminds me a little bit of the way that in 2016, when Bernie Sanders started talking about universal health care, people started bringing up all these problems with it as if this were this untried experiment that we were just considering for the first time how it would work, as if you couldn't just say, hey, Canada exists. This is clearly something that could happen. Well, similarly, I'd say in this case, hey, the rest of the first world exists. There are not a lot of other advanced industrialized democracies with anything approaching the kind of judicial review that we have. There are some, like the Republic of Ireland, that have some extremely limited form of it, that has all kinds of restrictions, that you have to have people in the elected branches actually requesting review. But I don't know of a lot of other Western democracies where there's anything like a Supreme Court that's just empowered to throw out any law that it deems to be unconstitutional on whatever grounds that it deems it to do. And so it seems like liberal democracy can indeed exist without that defense. And if we didn't have that to look at, if we were just considering it in the abstract, then I'd say, well, look, imagine that you were explaining this to somebody who'd never heard of it. That you had to explain this for the very first time to somebody who didn't know what Supreme Court meant, didn't know what judicial review meant. And you just said, hey, so we have these 9 guys. Generally, they went to Harvard or Yale, and we decided to give them the power to rewrite our laws, that they could just throw out any law that they like. Do you think that over time, long term, maybe sometimes their whims will take them one direction or another, but in the long term, do you think this is going to serve social and particularly economic equality? And it's kind of a funny question. Of course it wouldn't. I think that and what it does is it just preserves the preferences of previous governments against ones that have been elected more recently. So if you have had liberal governments elected in the past, and now you have conservative government, that's in power, then sure, having Supreme Court justices who are appointed by that past liberal government might lead to socially liberal rulings against socially conservative things the new government still wanted to do that we would like. But it can just as easily be the other way around. I mean, that you can have Brown versus Board. You can also have Dred Scott. There's absolutely no guarantee in the setup when, as Pisco says, you take the politics out of it and just consider it in the abstract. There's absolutely no guarantee that it's going to have the function of enforcing civil rights against attempts to roll back civil rights, rather than having the function of rolling back civil rights laws against people who try to impose it. There's nothing inherent in the institution that answers these questions. It's just an issue of what the actual human beings who are on it are and what their ideological preferences are.
Okay. All right. I will jump into it. I won't even pretend to be a neutral on this, because Pisco and I have battled over this very subject before a few times over the months we've known each other. So yeah, I'm on your side. Go ahead, Pisco.
All right. The first question is on the origins of this power. And first of all, does the origins matter? So does it matter to anybody that Marbury versus Madison is seen as a unilateral assumption of this power? I don't happen to think so, because in the Federalist Papers, we have indication from at least Hamilton that this power was conceived in Federalist 78. And, the interpretation is that is what the judicial power means. However, even if we didn't have that source of evidence, does it matter to anyone on this panel that the power was sort of, in the civics understanding, unilaterally taken by in Marbury versus Madison? Does that fact really matter?
Well, it might matter in a couple ways. One obvious way is that if you think that I think it renders sort of incoherent, or at least awkward, the idea that what it says in the Constitution should trump everything else, and that the Supreme Court is the enforcer of this, if what the Supreme Court does is not, in fact, authorized by the Constitution.
So I guess one question is, I agree with everyone, I think, on this panel that courts and ultimately the Constitution is here to make our lives better. Insofar as the Constitution and courts aren't achieving that aim, they should be adjusted so that they do achieve that aim. So I agree with everyone. That seems to be everyone's foundational principle. Does everyone here agree that the Constitution should be followed? If there is a Constitution, should that Constitution be followed in the state?
But Pisco, I disagree with your fundamental proposition there, in that I think part of the issue with the Supreme Court is that they are lawyers, and lawyers are trained to think about problems legally, which makes them disinclined to view systemic change or institutional change as a solution to things. It's always going to be like, how is this a legal problem, and what laws can we change in order to rectify this?
Well, I'm not there yet, Joe. With due respect, I before we get there, the fundamental question is, if there is a constitution, should we follow it?
Ben, you managed to unmute your.
Whereby?
Yeah, there's a keyboard shortcut you keep hitting. Don't worry about it. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. You want to respond, Joe?
So if the Constitution says, for instance, election will be on this day, should whatever legislature be allowed to not follow that rule in the abstract?
So is the issue just restricted to really clear things like that? Or
we'll get to due process and that sort of stuff.
Okay, well, the thing is, you can't really separate the issues, because if you're going to give it this power to enforce the clear parts of the Constitution, then you're also going to give it the power to enforce the other 97% of the Constitution.
Well, I haven't decided the institutional actor who's in charge of interpreting the Constitution yet. I'm just asking, as an abstract rule, if society has a rule and they put it in a Constitution, should it be followed in the abstract?
Sure, but I think that having the Constitution followed is, all else being equal, a good thing, and that might give us a reason to want to empower some actor to do that, but that's not necessarily decisive
for the
reason.
Courts. Yes, understood. So the next question is, does everyone here in our country, we have a federal system? I'm sure all these criticisms also apply to state constitutions and state court systems that determine for themselves that state laws are unconstitutional under their state constitutions. The criticism has to be robust like that, correct? it's not just the federal judiciary, correct?
Well, I mean, I don't see what the obligation is to say the same thing about both. I think that you could very well think that having a federal Supreme Court was too much power to give to those 9 guys, but getting to stop the New Hampshire state legislature from doing things isn't. So I don't think that you actually have to pick, but I would inclined to apply it there also.
So it's because it sounds like if history were another way, if we never had Dred Scott, if we never had Plessy, if we never had some of these bad court decisions, your opinion might be, or some people's opinion on this panel might be completely different, and that it's totally contingent on history, or is history just evidence?
Because what about the British system, which isn't constitutional? Like, I'm personally not sold on the idea that a constitutional system, even though I live in a constitutional legal system as well, but I'm not necessarily sold on the fact that the Constitution provides a better system of legal interpretation than common law.
Okay, I guess base one, should we have a constitution? I mean, that I think that having a constitution is important in this country, where we have pre-existing sovereigns, namely state governments, that we have to deal with, and we have to bind in a certain way and have buy-in into this new nation, and that's why we had it. That's kind of the historical roots of it. But
sure,
I mean,
so I guess well, how much should the Constitution cover, right? Because I understand, like, for instance, our Constitution compared to your Constitution is extremely limited in that it covers the way that political institutions should work and interact and nothing else. We don't have amendments like a Bill of Rights. So I think perhaps the American Constitution is overreaching.
So does everyone here think that we either shouldn't have a constitution or the Constitution is covered less? I mean, that would also, by the way, disempower federal legislatures. Remember, a lot of the times in terms of progress, the ones who are really keeping things down are state governments who are saying, no, we don't want you federal government, you don't have the authority. We'll sue you because you think you have the authority to tell us we can't do X or Y, or we'll sue you on the Voter Rights Act because we think that you can't legislate us under the Commerce Clause to have, for voting rights purposes. So oftentimes it's the federal government stepping in, right?
Well, I mean, if we're imagining this much more expansive issue, right? I thought we were just talking about judicial review, but if we're imagining this much more expansive issue about whether to have constitution at all, and we're putting that on the table, then in any fantasy scenario where we could get rid of that, we could surely also get rid of the states and just have a unitary republic. And that, by the way, unambiguously and without hesitation would be better.
Okay, so understood. All right, so I guess we can go back to judicial review now. Having the system that we have, what do we do now? And so I guess one solution might be to have a unitary republic and no federalism anymore. But should there, if we have a unitary republic, should there be a constitution?
But this isn't the same question as judicial review, because there are plenty of countries that have constitutions but either don't have judicial review at all or don't have anything like as expansive a form of judicial review as what we have in the United States.
Well, I'm just asking if you all think that the Constitution is a good idea as it is. And it sounds like, because I think it's good, right? So I want to defend it with things like judicial review, and I think that's a good way to defend it. But if we're disagreeing that there even should be a constitution, or the Constitution should be something different,
I mean, I don't even see why necessarily that should be part of the same discussion. I think that if we are going to have that discussion, I'd say that, I don't know. I mean, there are certainly possible constitutions that we could have that would be way, way better than what we have. There are other constitutions we could have that would be worse. Whether it would be a disaster to just have a common law system, I'm not even entirely sold, on that. But whatever. There are parts of the Constitution I like, parts of it that I don't like. Okay. But I think that the more interesting question is it a good idea to have 9 guys appointed for life, almost definitionally, coming from more elite, parts of society, since these are, supposed to be, like amazing lawyers to be anywhere near here, who are going to be empowered to interpret all of the incredibly vague stuff in the Constitution in order to get rid of any laws that they don't like. And that strikes me as a much easier question than something you're raising.
All right, so let's stay there then. One is I think people are overstating the authority of the Supreme Court, because the judicial power of the United States is not just given to the federal court, to the Supreme Court. it envisions, the Madisonian Compromise envisions other lower federal courts. And in fact, the Supreme Court is limited in its original jurisdiction. That's what Marbury versus Madison was all about. And there seems to be few, if any, limits to Congress's ability to strip jurisdiction from the Supreme Court and other federal courts. So the amount of power that the federal judiciary has, I think, is overstated. The federal, you have a case or controversy requirement. Think about remember the standing stuff that everyone was talking about during the election litigation where they were saying no Article 3 standing? That is a limitation on what cases the Supreme Court can hear. So I think to the extent that we're upset with how the federal judiciary is looking at cases.
That's not a limitation that's relevant to judicial review.
Sure it is.
Well, no. I mean, they have that's a very different question from are there federal laws that they're not empowered to get rid of if they don't like, which is the question that we're talking about. I also don't see what the Constitution, the constitutional ability of the legislature to restrict, to pass new laws restricting what the Supreme Court can look at doesn't actually tell us anything about how powerful the Supreme Court is right now, the same way that saying that who could be tried by the Spanish Inquisition and which punishments they could lay out was ultimately up to the King of Spain, meant that the Spanish Inquisition wasn't in its day extremely powerful.
But it limits the ability, right? So the implication is the judicial review is this authority, right? This authority to throw out any law that you want. And it's this kind of unilateral veto on any act of Congress or really any act of the state. And I'm trying to show that there are mechanisms in place, either through separation of powers, where we're giving Congress could cut the funding of the Supreme Court if they wanted to, as they did before in history.
So the issue is that there are ways that we could limit the power of judicial review they currently have, but that seems like a very different question from saying, is the level of judicial review they currently have too much power?
Okay, so but I'm saying that if Congress wanted to, we could do if we think it's too much power, there are ways to limit it. So now the question is the current status of judicial review too much? I don't think so. I mean, the courts often sit on cases until there's a circuit split. They have norms and traditions with respect to finding the thinnest ground to decide a case. Oftentimes those aren't followed. Oftentimes there are disagreements about what that ground should be. But Congress the Supreme Court is not in the game of just going to decide things in a partisan manner. I don't think.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Well,
no, they don't seek out on their own authority some case to decide for themselves. Those cases are brought in litigation, oftentimes to lower federal courts.
There's always many more cases brought than they could possibly decide. They pick the ones that they want to decide on, and very often it happens, for at least, not for routine cases, but for lots of, the most interesting, the most controversial cases, the one that you're most likely to hear about, those cases are very often decided on a 5-4 or God help us now 6-3, straight partisan basis. That's just true. And saying that, that they sometimes benevolently decide not to weigh in on things, or that there are certain traditions that they follow when they feel like it, about what grounds to decide things on. These are not very reassuring.
The majority of cases aren't partisan splits.
Oh,
the majority of cases
were partisan splits.
I understand, but so you said the important, profound cases that reach them will often be on partisan splits. That's a function of democracy, where we're sort of, on one hand, we're criticizing the court for not being democratic enough, but when democracy produces an outcome of a very split country, you have a very split court. So it sounds like we have a polity problem and not a court problem.
It's not. It is a court problem because the objection isn't to democracy. The objection is to having the dead hand of previous governments that have already been voted out of office still have this much of a say in which current legislation is allowed to be passed.
You don't see a benefit to that possibly? I mean,
I think there could be benefits, but that doesn't mean that I think that it's a good thing. Look, if we had a House of Lords, that was allowed to slow down or stop some legislation, I'm sure that there would be benefits, because I'm sure there'd be cases where the House of Lords wouldn't let things through that I would like. That doesn't mean that I want to have a House of Lords or that the in-principle objection isn't relevant.
So it sounds like
earlier you were saying it sounded like those, we, and I know I'm talking too much, but stop. Earlier it sounded like you said it sounded like we were saying that it's just because they've made a bunch of bad decisions, that's why we don't like it. But it seems like you're trying to appeal to that same thing as like, oh, what about the good decisions?
Mhm.
And I'd also, by the way, be very curious about this with you, right? That they have is it really just the case that the sort of in principle argument for having some sort of body like this is all that sways you, and you're just totally indifferent to how it's played out in practice? Or, as it sounded like you suggested earlier, is your actual reason for liking it that you think that in practice enough of the time it's going to have good results?
Well, I think, yeah. So in principle, my reason for liking judicial review and court systems in general is because I think it, on balance, produces good results and allows people to order their lives and settles questions. So one of the reasons that we have things like stare decisis, or we have to appeal to the dead hand of history, is because at a certain point, I think we just have to decide that a problem is settled and we have to move on. And those, I think, principles of comity or respect or I don't know, efficiency compel us not to relitigate all the old fights every year, every time we have a new court. If we have a problem with it, there are mechanisms to change different interpretations. There are reasons why you can overturn previous acts, or if there's enough democratic impulse, I'm sure there's always stuff you can do. But I think that having things like judicial review and stare decisis allow us to have people with settled expectations to order their lives. So that's one of the reasons why I like it, because I think it promotes stability. And so, yeah, if it didn't have good outcomes, maybe I would be different. Maybe we'll have a fight, I guess, on the merits of how good those outcomes have been. But is the same true on the other side? I mean, if the history was just shown that the Supreme Court just got it right every time, would that change the principle of these 9 philosopher kings ruling on high and deciding what is and what's not law? Would that change anything?
Well, I mean, it would change part of it, but it wouldn't. There's an important part of it that it wouldn't change. It would, I think that some of the pragmatic argument would go away, but I think that the in principle democratic objection would still be there.
Can you repeat the in principle democratic objection for me just one more time? Sorry.
Sure. That it's not reasonable that you have these 9 totally unaccountable people, who the voters have no way of doing anything about, who have the ability to strike down any law that a good lawyer can make an argument violates some of the incredibly vague and often conflicting principles in the Constitution.
Why is it unreasonable? You said it was unreasonable to allow it.
Because I think democratic self-government is a good thing, and I think that this is too much of a limitation on that.
I mean, couldn't I say the same thing about the Senate? I mean, the Senate is.
Oh yeah, Senate sucks.
Okay. So yeah. Is it the mere fact there is a democratic control there? You elect. Now there's a little bit of arbitrariness to this, as one can see from the Trump administration. In 4 years, you had 3 justices. So I understand that aspect of it, and I think that that's extremely frustrating, and the extent to which both the president and Congress were able to manipulate the system to pack essentially the judiciary with Republican and Federalist judges is concerning. But that is a democratic check. It's something. It's not no democratic check. So why is it too little?
Go ahead, Joe.
Well,
but that's a huge problem for me, Pisco, because part of the reason that you're validating the existence of the court is that it's there to provide a check on these democratic institutions. And yet you have something like the First Amendment. It took 174 years before the Supreme Court ever did anything about a Congress ruling on the grounds of the First Amendment.
Well, they didn't have incorporation doctrine for so long, right? So they didn't.
Regardless, how often is the Constitution used against the people, and how often is it used against the government? How often does the Supreme Court rule in favor of the government and corporate interests, and how often, or to silence dissent, and how often is it used to protect those rights? Yes, you can name a few flashy cases where it was progressive, but given the weight of all cases, how often does the Supreme Court rule in favor of individual citizens?
That shouldn't matter, right? So right now we've moved on from the pragmatic, I think.
How should that not matter if you're arguing that it's an important check on democratic institutions?
So I thought that we had moved past the pragmatic, what the court actually has ruled. If you want to go through the court's sins, I mean, I'm happy to do so. In terms of indigenous rights, Go ahead.
No, we know the court sims. What I'm saying is, if you're saying that it is a democratic check and that is a reason to justify the existence of a court, tell me how it's working in favor of the people and not in favor of corporates and the government.
Okay, so the ways it's helping, or in some ways it's a check on democracy. It helps the rights of minorities, but sometimes it does that in ways you don't agree with, right? So for instance, DC versus Heller, right? That is a case that people on this panel probably don't agree with. That the Constitution, the Second Amendment, respects an individual right to have a gun, right? That was striking down a popularly elected law in the District of Columbia, and there was later cases that applied it to the states as well, because that's of course a federal land, and so that is a check on the democracy of DC. But at a level of generality, it's an affront to the democracy of DC. But at a level of generality that if we move up, you could see it as a defense of democracy over the whole country, right? So it depends on how you look at so how it's defending or not defending democracy depends on your unit of measure and what level of generality you're looking at.
And it also depends on what you seem reluctant to give any ground to, which is the court is inherently political. And I'll let you keep your court if you at least admit that every actor there is political and making decisions on political grounds. I think this mythology of the apolitical, this scientific legislation, come on.
They do. Sorry. They do decide, they're people, right? So what Ben said is I think totally true, that of course, I think politics influences a lot of this. And I think that there are certain justices, of course, for whom it contributes more to their rulings than others. But if they weren't somewhat political, then they wouldn't be democratic, right? The nature of being democrat, having a link to democracy, is that I think is an inherently political one.
So I'm smiling like crazy because everything Joe is saying I've said to Pisco previously. We've had the words he's saying right now are exactly the words he said to me months ago, and I still think your retort's not all that great. But go ahead if anyone wants to respond to that.
So essentially, I was just saying that it's any kind of democratic link, I think, is kind of a political one. And if you want the court to be more responsive to democratic impulse and the polity, then they're being responsive in a political fashion. And so you can't accuse them of being anti-democratic and being... No,
you can, because the confusion is that the anti-democratic part is about them being a block on the current will of the people. Because what it does, again, is it essentially lets governments that are out of power continue to have a say.
So do old laws, right? So do old statutes that they govern. That's just as dead hand of history as old Supreme Court rulings, old federal laws. But we don't seem to have.
But current office holders are able to overturn old federal laws, and they're not allowed to just vote to disrespect Supreme Court rulings. So I think that there is a different sense in which it stops people from exercising their current democratic preferences, and so I don't think that there's any contradiction between having this democratic objection to the Supreme Court and also thinking that it's even worse because it's not like they're somehow mind melded with the constitutional framers and just sort of giving voice to the objective meaning of the Constitution, which is probably impossible in any case.
Yeah. But I'm glad we recognize that this interpretation game, there is no correct interpretation. Right?
Okay, well, if there's no correct interpretation, then I don't understand why we started the discussion by asking if we should enforce the Constitution. Because if there's no correct interpretation, then that whole question is just moot.
I think there's more absurd ones and there's less absurd ones, and we have to. Who says that the Fifth Amendment tells us that you have to give Miranda warnings? But you cited the Warren Court. These criminal procedure cases, or I don't know if you mentioned a criminal procedure case, but that's some of what the liberal court is known for, is all these wonderful criminal procedure protections for defendants. Those are, who says that the Fifth Amendment says Miranda, right? No one says that. That was an interpretation of the Warren Court. And maybe they're wrong, but I think there are shades of how wrong you can be that determine whether or not it's a good, okay ruling. And the question is, where do we fall on that line? But the goal of trying to interpret the Constitution in a reasonable way is one I think that everyone has to be okay with.
Well, again, as you say, I think that there is enough, I think we can at least agree that there's enough ambiguity about it, that hoping that just the words of the Constitution are going to somehow protect us against really bad or liberty violating things that the legislature does is extremely unrealistic. Depending on who's on the court, sure, maybe they'll do things that are nice and expand liberty, like giving us Miranda rights, or maybe they'll do terrible things that really restrict and undermine and roll back existing liberties, like Dred Scott. But ultimately, I think if we look at the historical record, I think that it's been much more of a force for harm than a force for good. B, I think that the in principle, democratic argument is one that that has a lot of weight for me. That I think that we should, at the very least, the default should be letting people have a higher degree of democratic self-government unless we have a really good reason not to. And C, I think that if you think, and this is a much bigger political question, but if you think that that if you are more worried about lack of fundamental change than about too much of it, that also gives you a reason to be very suspicious of an institution that is, as I think you said earlier, innately conservative, because what it exists to do
Is conserve.
Is to give past governments a veto power over the acts of current governments.
So is this exclusive to the legislative power? I mean, imagine that the administration says something like, the federal government has taken control of all steel mills in the country.
Awesome.
Now, so the Supreme Court, okay, the Supreme Court, right? Their power of review of executive action, you must criticize that as well, correct? They don't have the right to tell the democratically elected president what to do. I mean, they are unanswerable philosopher kings.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, in that case, it sounds like the president is doing a good thing, and they're stopping him. I don't know how this.
So let me change it, right? So now let me change it. Trump decides we are going to put every non-citizen into a labor camp.
Yeah, I think that in that circumstance, it could be that that in something that extreme, sure, I might be grateful to have that power to stop it from happening in that emergency. Just like if we had a king who was empowered to veto the prime minister and say no, your hereditary monarch has said what you've done is unacceptable. Then I could easily imagine a circumstance in which the prime minister was some sort of reactionary lunatic, and the king, I don't know, was more detached from politics. The king understood that allowing immigration was good for business, and so he wanted to stop something like that. But that doesn't mean that, generally speaking, I think it's a good idea.
But it's one more check, right? So having
Pisco, surely that's an issue with executive power and the amount of yes. You can't say, oh, get rid of, like, how is that the judicial? Like, you can't justify a judicial wing based purely on having an overpower, like a manipulatable executive office.
The fact that the power is split is the power of the fact that the power is split is the real, I think, boon to the courts. The fact that it's not a concentration of authority into one or two, but three separate branches, I think, which gives which is the boon, I think. If the president got to decide and with only a check on Congress, or I don't even know what could Congress do in that situation if the president just unilaterally decided to put everyone in camp?
This is what I mean. That's an issue for the executive.
Put all funding to the labor camps and stop it cold, so that that's a power it could exercise anytime it wants to.
Sure.
But I think the larger point is, sure, can you come up with fantasy scenarios where it would be where
not fantasy just happened, right? The last 4 years, big checks on Trump.
It didn't just happen. This is actually a really important point, that in fact Trump has been one of the weakest presidents on any objective grounds in recent American history, if not in America, like going back a very long time, and that's not mostly because of the Supreme Court. But also, yeah, sure, you can come up with both real examples and fantasy scenarios and things that are maybe somewhere in between, where a legislature or executive would do something bad and the Supreme Court would stop it. You could also come up with fantasy scenarios as well as real historical examples, and I would argue more of them, in which the Supreme Court is the one doing something bad and stopping the legislature from trying to stop it, or stopping the legislature from doing something good. Which sure, in principle, this is a power that could be used for good purposes and could be used for bad purposes. But the question is, A, does the historical record, do our best guesses about the future make us think we're going to have more of one than the other? And B, if it is a wash, which I don't think it is, but if it is a wash, in principle, do we like the idea of having more democracy or less democracy?
In the mind run of cases, what do you think is more likely in this country? That like state actors and the executive branch is going to do something you don't like, or the judicial department is going to do something you don't like? I mean, we have states right now that currently on the books make abortion illegal. What do we have to say about that? We have a lot of people in this country who just don't see the world as we do, or as you do, or as I do. What's more likely that the
what's more likely that the 6-3 conservative Supreme Court at any point in the next few decades is going to be a meaningful check on abortion restrictions, or that they're going to make socially conservative decisions that I don't like? I think probably the second one. I think that if you have, honestly, I think that we're probably have a better chance at this point of keeping abortion, by democratic mechanisms than otherwise. Just like in Ireland, for example, they just legalized it not that long ago by a popular referendum, and frankly, I'd be much more comfortable. I'd be much more comfortable counting on that. And I'd also say, as far as predictions go, that all right, which of the two am I more confident on? That if some future conservative congressional majority and president wanted to outlaw abortion, that the 6-3 conservative Supreme Court would stop it, or am I more confident that if there was a future government that had Medicare for all or a Green New Deal or anything like that, that they would come up with some marvelously creative constitutional reason why we couldn't have those? That's the second.
So I want to make space for you, Chris. Chris, you want to say something?
Yeah, just really quick. I have like two small points and then a question. So Ben earlier mentioned that like not many other countries do things our way. It does look like there's a few, and so I'm interested what you think about them. It looks like of the countries that do it on sort of the U.S. model, Norway is the closest to ours, especially in the frequency of how often they use the power of judicial review. And way earlier, I could repost the link, but posted a link in chat to a Cambridge book called Judicial Review in Norway that basically just tracks 200 years of debates in the public about this, because it is a hotly debated thing every time the court strikes something down, probably more so than for us. But it does seem like also Denmark and Sweden have something like it, but they also have like lower courts or councils that tend to do most of the work of determining whether or not a piece of legislation is constitutional or not, or whether it should be thrown out. And some of that seems to be like a pre-check where the parliament will say, hey, is this going to fly? And they're going to say probably not. And so then they just don't do it. So related to that, my question then is like, for those of you who are saying, okay, we don't need judicial review, like what sort of mechanism or system do you envision? And does it, like, I'm always like, I do political theory, and so obviously like I like the Federalist Papers Pisco keeps talking about, like it's fun for me, but like, so do you envision combining the legislative and interpretive powers? Like, do you envision having a system of government where the democratically elected lawmakers are both making and interpreting their own laws? And if so, like, is there any check on that?
Anyone?
Okay. I was gonna let somebody else talk because I feel like okay. So yeah, look, I think that we could have I think some system in which there was some much more limited form of judicial review, like some of the examples that you just mentioned. I wouldn't necessarily have a big problem with that. I think that we could also probably have a system where there was there was basically no judicial review. That the Supreme Court was the highest court of appeal, but it was not in the business of rewriting and overturning laws. And I think that would probably be fine too. I mean, what I'm confident about is that right now, we give this unelected super legislature way too much power in terms of what a reasonable amount of reduced power to look like, whether we have to go back down to none, or whether there's some severely restricted version that would be okay. We'd have to, I'm much less confident about that than I am about the general principle that what we have right now is way more than we should have in a democracy.
Oh, okay. So just to be clear, you would also, the implication of what you answered to my other question, extend that to executive action as well. The Supreme Court and federal judiciary as a whole, and I guess state judiciary, should not be in the business of reviewing to overturn executive action.
Yeah, that's right. I think that I think your example about the steel mill, steel mills was, I think, a really telling one, because that's exactly the kind of scenario in which I think that we're most likely to see really expansive Supreme Court decisions striking down executive actions. But I'd also go back to Silly Serious's point that I think that the question of what the right balance of power is between the legislative and the executive, I think, is just a different question from whether we should have nine philosopher kings who can just veto laws, or for that matter veto executive actions. I don't know. I mean, I like I like parliamentary systems where there is much less of a separation between those two in the first place, but that's I think that's also a somewhat separate question.
Yeah. And Eucharist, I think we're in a period of excessive litigation because particularly the left has lost its trust in the political apparatus and the nation state as an engine to create social and economic change. So we're using litigation and taking things to the Supreme Court and imbuing it with this sort of apolitical power to create social change. And this comes back to when Pisco was talking about Miranda rights. For me, as someone who's largely an abolitionist, that actually entrenches a lot of the problems that we have by making them look legitimate and making it look progressive. We have these rights now and they're protected by the court. I think ultimately, so long as we continue to look at things litigiously, we're stuck within a legal framework, and it will always be difficult to have overwhelming social change, which we need by creating strong social movements, which then funnel through democratic institutions.
So
what about disputes between states? I mean, you have
federalism's always going to be a stumbling block, isn't it? But
isn't it one that you have an answer to? Because imagine that the state of Alabama wants to challenge some action done by the state of Georgia. This Congress maybe doesn't have a say in this, but I mean, courts should still be there to resolve disputes between those actors, right?
Yeah, so I think that the disputes between states. I mean, again, if we even have states. Which I'm not crazy about, honestly. But I think disputes between states are probably on the model, where you could have some severely restricted, version of judicial review that wouldn't be nearly as offensive. I think that disputes between states are probably the instance of it that would bother me the least.
What about between other branches of the federal government? So Congress tries to sue Trump for whatever reason because they're not listening to him. We said don't spend any treasure, but you're doing it anyway. But I guess that then you would say, well, what are the courts going to do if he's already not listening to Congress? Is that your answer to that?
Well, I don't know that it's my answer to that, but I do think it's a good question in that scenario. I do think, again, I'd say very similarly to disputes between the states that I'm much less bothered by judicial review that's being used to resolve disputes between different elected bodies, whether different states or different branches of the federal government, than I am about judicial review in the sense of just getting to flatly decide that any old act of Congress violates their interpretation of the Constitution.
Here's one, right? Assuming states, right? So I have to assume states for this hypothetical, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Assume states Part of the state constitution says, and all people of Hispanic origin shall hereby not have any rights. Congress can't change that. No federal law can change that. That's state constitutional law. Congress can't amend that. The people in the state themselves are enforcing that law because it's state law. So it seems like, other than the courts, the other scenario would be like war, right? What else? What do you do in that scenario? If the state constitution, which is not part of the federal legislature, says
Do you have
something,
referendums in America? Is the referendum system?
But imagine that it's 80% of the state. We agree. We hate Hispanics. It's remember, this is pure minority versus on that level. It's democracy,
Okay.
right? Because their democratic impulse is pure racism and hatred of Hispanics.
Yeah. Well,
Did the
I think
Supreme
it
that
was
happened
telling.
in the
I'm
past?
sorry.
It did
the
happen in the past.
Spectre.
I mean,
Jim
yeah,
Crow.
What's that?
yeah. The Supreme Court did a great job of stamping that out, and Reconstruction went fantastically. Yeah.
Well, no,
You're
no,
talking
but
about it.
And of course, it is telling. Remember, let's go back to Dred Scott. The Supreme Court has done exactly the opposite of that. That it has stripped away, the illegal rights of racial minorities when those had been those had been recognized by some states. So it can go either way. And so the question is, are we more worried about democratic acts, being racist and terrible, and so that we hope that the Supreme Court would save us, or are we more worried about democratic acts being good and necessary, and the Supreme Court stopping them? And I would again just say that I'm much more worried about the second thing. I think that some of this, again, I don't think it could be discussed in a non-political way. I think that if you think that things are basically fine, then I think that I could see being much more worried about negative, democratic decisions, being allowed to go unchecked. But if you think things that are very deeply and fundamentally not fine, then I think it makes a lot more sense to be more worried about it being harder to change those things.
Do you think that it makes sense to have a preference for keeping what we already have? So keeping that protected as opposed. So do you understand my question? So I'm essentially
sure.
asking. Okay.
Yeah. I think it makes sense in the sense that I can understand how somebody could think so. Sure. Do I think it makes sense in the sense that I agree? No, I don't. I think that, in a sense, that's actually, that's kind of funny because, right, that's one of the classic definitions of conservatism. I don't think it's Edmund Burke, but it's like one of those guys, right, standing athwart history and saying no. And so if the question is do I understand how somebody could be a conservative and why? Sure. If the question is how sympathetic am I to that posture, the answer is not very much.
But conservative, do you think conservative with respect to, say, criminal procedure rights, that is really what people mean when they say conservative? Like if I say, no, I really want to protect those rights, those rights are old. Does that make me a conservative to want to protect those advances that we've had?
Look, there are things that, I don't think that you can decide these things entirely on the basis of, obviously there are things that have existed for a long time that I'd like to conserve. There are lots more things that greatly outnumber them that have existed for a really long time that I would like to get rid of. But I do think that the overall effect of something like this is going to be to benefit well-entrenched hierarchies rather than to benefit social progress. Not in every case, but I do think that's going to be its overall tendency.
And largely because it's much easier to create institutional power that already exists. If you're ruling in favor of what already exists, that's obviously going to have more power than putting in a ruling that has no institutional backing or corporate backing or social backing.
So of all the court now is definitely conservative. What are you most worried about with respect to judicial review in the coming years? You mentioned Green New Deal policies. Can you name me some sort of agendas or provisions that you're worried that the Supreme Court might stymie?
Look, I think that you can come up again with, I think that part of the problem is that given that that we're not talking about clear-cut things, that the Constitution is full of vague general principles, many of whom often point in different directions, etc. I think that to be a good lawyer is to be able to come up with arguments that that those principles point in whatever direction that you want, and so we don't have to go as far as things like Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. We can look. I mean, look at Obamacare. That it was saved because one moderate conservative justice decided that it would be too destabilizing to get rid of it. And
That's a little editorializing, isn't it?
This is all editorializing. Am I
Right,
supposed
yeah.
to put something other than
No,
editorial?
fair enough. But I mean,
It's about what the setting is.
arguably, right, a Medicare for all program would be more constitutional than Obamacare. We already
Sure.
have, it's just the government spending money, right? So what would be, how could you think that could be unconstitutional?
Well,
I'm
I
sure
mean,
it'll be in court.
If it's not just the government spending money, like a universal public option, but it's also creating a government monopoly in health insurance, which is what Medicare for all does. I think it gets a little bit easier to see how that argument would be made, but also
Congress
again,
bans drugs, right? So,
yeah, I mean, so you're giving all of the arguments that would be given by Supreme Court justices who wanted to keep it, and fair enough. But what I'm saying is, I don't think we should underestimate the ability of a good constitutional lawyer to come up with arguments the other way. It's not like I don't think, at the very least, let's say this much. It's not like cases wouldn't be brought about all of these things. It's not like lots of clever Federal Society ghouls wouldn't come up with wouldn't have clever arguments against the constitutionality of all of these things. And without saying that the actual words of the Constitution have no effect, I think that part of the political equation that they have to take in mind is the degree to which something seems like a stretch, although that doesn't always stop them. That there are cases that we could think of where things seem like absolutely ludicrous interpretive stretches, but they still go for them anyway. But there is going to be a general tendency for them to rule in whatever way, like once you've got the constitutional arguments for and against in place, whatever way fits with their ideological preferences. And I think anything that really strongly violated those ideological preferences I think there is a very great danger that those will be struck down. And by the way, I'm not even just thinking about conservative justices here. I'm also thinking about liberal ones. That I think that people who are appointed by centrist presidents like Clinton and Obama, I wouldn't necessarily, who sure you can more or less count on them to be liberal and on some certain kinds of social issues. They are okay, but often not great on criminal, on those procedural, criminal defendant issues. Sometimes pretty bad in some cases. And I certainly wouldn't count on them to have my back in the case of any sort of future left-wing government that was trying to institute a really expansive agenda of economic reform,
such as eliminate property ownership, right?
I mean, I don't think we have to go anywhere close to that level to trigger those worries.
So is there a concern then that I'm not using radical in a bad sense? I think radical is often a good word.
Sure.
That is the concern that even the left wing of the court would look with disdain at radical change.
Yeah, I would at the very least, not be super confident that they would uphold the constitutionality of relatively radical changes. And since I think that really radical changes are desperately needed, that's a big problem from my perspective.
Is there an assumption here that you should always win? That whatever. So what if sometimes the right just gets to win?
Is that the majority should win, which could sometimes be a majority that agrees with me. It could sometimes be a majority be a majority that disagrees with me. But the assumption here is about democracy. You know, that's the in principle objection. And again, I am also interested in the pragmatic objection, which is about specific consequences. That I think no matter how we have it set up, judicial review or not, no judicial review, I'll lose sometimes. But if one of those options is going to mean that I'm going to lose a hell of a lot more often than I would with the other option, then that I think that is a real consideration.
And also, Pisco, it relates to your argument for the Supreme Court in that it is there to protect minorities or the weak and the downtrodden. It's not a matter of should one side always win. It's that if that's a justification for the existence of the Supreme Court, then the rulings better do that.
They do it when they should, or implying that the rulings are correct. You know, sometimes the minority loses justly, right? So if you might have a claim, a free speech claim, because you think that, you know, the parlor, that Twitter is a public forum, and that you have a right not to have your post be deleted by Twitter and the deep state, but you could be wrong about that. So,
but then this right and wrong thing is so normative, and this is what ultimately liberals refuse to acknowledge.
Yeah, it's a bit begging the question, but you know,
because First Amendment defenses weren't used for Davis.
Yeah, for what, sorry?
For the leader of the Communist Party during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah.
When he was prosecuted for teaching Marxism.
That's an example of a lot of the bad Supreme Court law, I'll admit, is in the immigration side. Courts have recognized what's called the so-called plenary power of federal government in dealing with immigration. That has been disastrous for a lot of non-citizens. You have no substantive right to stay in this country. And so I agree on the merits there. And they went after communists, especially with those immigration policies, in a way that would sort of...
Well, he was taken on conspiracy charges for teaching Marxism.
I hear that. And I know that there's case law that says, like, you know, this support for the Communist Party is inherently dangerous speech or incitement to violence or that kind of stuff. So, you know, I'm not going to agree with the court on everything here. But sometimes minorities don't get to win, and I think we should be careful about assuming that we always are the ones that deserve to win.
Sure, but what I took to be Silly Serious's point is that it sounded earlier like a big part of your argument for judicial review was that this was a necessary thing to defend minority rights. So if there are a lot of cases, and maybe even predictably a lot of cases, where it's not going to serve that function and might even do the opposite of that, then that does seem like it undermines at least that argument.
It has the capacity to protect minorities. I guess you would say, well, so does Congress, so does every legislature have the capacity to protect minorities.
It also has the capacity to hurt minorities.
Correct. But in this country, I guess, I don't know, I'm worried about my natural steady state is I'm worried about the excesses of faction and of political partisanship and outrage, and the fact that we have a federal system in which people think very differently in certain states makes me especially worried of those state legislatures. And I think it's, you know, one of the discussions in the Constitutional Convention is whether the federal government should have a literal veto on state laws passed in the various states. I think as a matter of federalism, the federal judiciary serves a worthwhile check on state action that would affect minorities in those states. I agree that it's harder. I think my job is harder. Perhaps it is. I think my job is made a lot harder if there are no states, and so I would agree with that.
Okay, but this is also okay. So this is still a pragmatic issue. Like, are we more worried?
Yep.
About democratic majorities, either in a state or nationally, doing things that we don't like, or are we more worried about democratic majorities not being able to?
Yeah. Well, that's all. So I agree. So everything I'm a pragmatist for everything. I think everything is reducible to pragmatism. So if you were to tell me, democratically, it's just not fair, that argument doesn't have any purchase with me about fundamental fairness. Ultimately, everything is about outcomes.
Okay, well, I like democratic fairness. That does have some purchase with me, but I mean, I think that if yeah, I mean, if it's a pragmatic question, then I think this does kind of get down to what you like. Again, like which kinds of outcomes that you're more worried about, and that's going to have a lot to do with with liberalism, versus socialism and things like that. And so I think that's maybe the underlying argument here.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right.
Tam, I hate interrupting this amazing conversation because it's really, really good. This is amazing. I'm loving it. Especially the part when we're proving Pisco wrong on this. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
We have different fears, I think. I think Ben just distilled it in its purest and best way. I think that was a wonderful distillation of the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that, of the arguments I've heard against judicial review, these have been some of the strongest.
Hey, oh, awesome. So happy to have gathered you all to talk about this. Fantastic. So Ben has a limited amount of time, and because of that, I figured we go to our next topic. Probably our last topic, actually, because I don't think we'll be able to fit anything else in. But all right, breaking up big tech and big tech censorship. I'm really curious as to where you all will stand on this. So we'll do a actually, do we want to do a closing statement on the last thing, or are we good? Do you have any?
I think Ben
words?
did it perfectly.
Okay.
I think that was ultimately the conflict.
Okay, great, fantastic. All right, so we'll jump right into it. Go ahead, Eucharist. What do you think about that one?
Oh boy, man, it's such a broad topic, and I have so many thoughts on it. I might do better to just let somebody else talk first, and then I can have more direction because I can ramble. But I guess obviously, like what the people that I know are freaking out about is Trump getting banned from basically every platform on the internet. So his phone is a brick now, which is really satisfying in a lot of ways. And for some people that's really troubling. It's you get the the Hollies of the world now who want to sue book publishers because they're backing out of book contracts because that's what it says in the First Amendment. You have a right to publish a book, right? And then you have the conservatives of the world who are really, really concerned that they don't have a space anymore to voice their opinions, which they frequently voice in public forums, which is interesting. And then I think the Parler thing is something that I'm still like coin flippy on, because it's like, in principle, I want to say, yeah, of course you can talk about your ideas wherever you want. Nobody has to let you do it in their space, right? If I'm saying things a coffee shop owner doesn't like, they can tell me to leave. Same way with Facebook, Twitter, whatever. And then we have this instant where Amazon Web Services says, well, now you're breaking our terms of service. You can't use our service either. Of course, there are other web services. So I don't know. It's a very broad issue. And this is something that I get really into because where I think I align with most of you as opposed to my friends on the right, is that I see threats to liberty from corporations and tech just as much as I do from scary big government stuff. So I'm just interested in seeing what you guys have to say on it and see where the conversation goes.
Okay, great. Pisco.
Sure. I think there are two ways you can look at this. One is as a matter of First Amendment constitutional law. Is this claim valid? I think that is a pretty big slam dunk on the part of the corporate people in charge right now in Twitter and Facebook. I don't think these platforms are public fora. If they were, I think that would have incredible implications and impossible line drawing for the courts to do. And I would not actually. I think this would be a matter totally out of the competency of the federal judiciary to say, for instance, above 100,000 users, active users, as opposed to any other kind of. I don't think that they're tech savvy enough, and I wouldn't want the federal judiciary to decide the metes and bounds of these issues. So I guess that's one instance of a federal judiciary oversight that I wouldn't like. That said, to me, these don't have any of the hallmarks of traditional public fora, and they haven't been designated by the government as such. So I think it's a slam dunk on a constitutional level for the companies. The broader question, I think Lecture Fan's wrong about that and all those other people. The broader question I think people are worried about is we're in a pretty weird spot now, because even though I think these aren't public fora, they're starting to become more important and more involved. Not starting to, they are universal and ubiquitous in our lives. And as a matter of just practical reality, they are the platforms that people use to communicate. And so I'm a little bit troubled, I'm not going to lie, and maybe more than a little bit, about the quickness and the completeness and the utter silencing that happened in such a fast way. And this is, I guess, another question of institutional competency, which is forget about the courts, forget about the legislatures, corporate interests. Should we give corporate America unilateral veto on anything? And so I don't think we're at the point where we have to be sort of up in arms and at Twitter headquarters or anything like that, And I'm sure that maybe, Twitter could be useful partners in crafting some regulation, or maybe the government should make their own social media platform. But I am a little troubled by what happened.
Vector.
Right. So I have a very, very nuanced take on this position, and I'm going to try and choose my words as carefully as possible here. So am I upset that fascists are being deplatformed from social media now? Not fucking really. Am I slightly concerned about the fact that this decision rests in the hands of a couple of greedy technocrats up in San Francisco? Yeah, that's a fucking problem for me. Not due to the fact that I'm concerned about this being weaponized against the left. I mean, that is concerned, don't get me wrong, but as far as I can tell, most of the leftist shit posters I know are on their 5th Twitter account and getting out of their 3rd stint in Facebook jail, right? So this idea that it's going to be weaponized against the left if we cede any more power to these people, we ceded that power. The Rubicon's been crossed. That's already happening. What concerns me about it is that as far as I can tell, for the last 4 years, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they were more than happy to allow these fascists to radicalize people through their platforms and organize in their spaces right up until the point where it made them look bad enough that they were afraid it was going to affect their bottom line. That's not a good motivation to be policing these places. That's not the way I want to see them policed. And frankly, I just don't trust the profit motive to be good enough to keep us safe from what I would deem to be extremely harmful speech. So yeah, do I have a solution? Nationalize the companies? I mean, there are conservatives that are certainly starting to get on board with that, but their motivation for doing so seems to be they don't want fascist deplatforms. So I'm like, okay, well, we agree that there's a problem, but our solution and the reason for wanting it seem to be very different. So yeah, this is a mess. My position is really nuanced and not exactly fleshed out to where I have an answer. I'm interested in seeing what everybody else has to say.
Jill, this is serious.
Yeah. I didn't think of this through the lens of Trump or Parler, which I understand is odd, but I was just thinking about big tech generally and the inefficacy of antitrust actions against them thus far. I am a tech socialist. I do believe that there should be public ownership of the large platforms. I know it is a difficult thing to do, but I think it is necessary. And I think at the core of that needs to be who's involved in ownership and making sure that workers are involved. It's not just solely government ownership. I think that surveillance laws and privacy laws need to be not just at the very core of any public ownership, but throughout all of it. I don't know. It should be everywhere. It needs to be, because for me, that's the most terrifying part of a government-owned tech space is the threat of surveillance being used by the government against the citizens, which is why it does need to be such a central part. And obviously there are big problems with this, such as the global nature of tech, and there would need to be workarounds for this. I don't think it's impossible, though, and I think it's something that if we should start working on now, because if we're going to bother with antitrust laws and if we're going to bother trying to break up big tech, why not start work on radical action?
Love it. Ben Burgess.
Yeah, so earlier Eucharist said that Trump's phone being a brick now can be very satisfying, calls me very troubling, and I just say, why not both? It's very funny that happened. No doubt about that. But I also think it is incredibly troubling that you could have the president, even the president of the United States could have so many of his lines of communication to the general public that have been so important cut by the decision of a few tech CEOs. That's super disturbing. I agree with Pisco that there's no constitutional ground for objecting to it, and quite separately from the argument we just had about how this sort of thing should work in any case. I think that legally challenging, the ability of private corporations to do this is probably a non-starter, and I don't, I mean, I think I think that it's very hard to make sense of the idea that they certainly do or even could have any sort of legal obligation to let people do what they want with their platform, because then you start thinking, okay, well, the New York Times is a private corporation too, right? Is there, we going to stop them from doing what they want with their platform? Uh, so I think all of which gives me a reason to agree with Spectre and Silly Series that that gives us a good reason to look at some form of public ownership of at least some of the big tech platforms, because it's extremely disturbing that this few that a handful of plutocrats would have this much control over the flow of information, and B, I like the fact that this would mean that they would have that it would be much harder to regulate and silence speech on these platforms if they were publicly owned, because the First Amendment would apply. And I think that that's a good thing. Now, I don't think that means that you could have literally no regulation on anything that anybody said. If your like city council meeting has a public comment section, I'm pretty sure that you're not allowed to to go up to the microphone and start screaming swear words and anti-Semitic slurs. That you would be stopped from that, and nobody thinks that's a constitutional problem to stop you from doing that. And so I think there could be restrictions on some things that you could say even within a format like that. But I guess to me, this is another thing where it gets down to what you're more worried about, and I am much more worried about. I'm much more worried about overreaching corporate censorship than I am worried about the bad effects of letting bad speech be uncensored. So I think that I would be willing to take that trade. That that it would be easier than it may be now to say horrible and vile and disgusting things on these platforms, not necessarily unrestricted, but much easier than it is now. But it would also be much harder for corporations that own these things. Well, that it wouldn't be up to them in the first place. Would be the idea that so therefore it would be much harder to stop things that I want to be uncensored. And in some ways, even though this is a very different issue because it's not a legal question, I don't think it can be a legal question. I think it's a policy question. Who's the who do we want in charge of these platforms? Is not a question of free speech in the legal sense, but I do think that a lot of the shape of the argument is very similar to the shape of the argument when it comes to what to free speech in the legal sense. That if we didn't have a First Amendment, if it was easier to censor people, then that would be good in the sense that that Richard Spencer couldn't do what he does. But it would be very bad in lots of other cases. And so I think, okay, there could be a principled argument. I'm not willing to throw those out entirely. Those have some weight for me. And also I think that, again, there's a question about what you're most, what you're most worried about. And I think, again, because I do want radical social change, I'm much more worried about voices, calling for that kind of change, being silenced, than I am about people saying horrible things not being silenced.
All right, open to the panel.
I would like to lay out the places we agree. It seems we all agree that one, this is probably legally okay. Two, that we're all a little bit concerned about this, or maybe even more than that. And three, even if government was in charge of these platforms, you could probably have some reasonable regulation. Does everyone here agree with those premises?
Mm-hmm.
So the analogy I'm going to present to people who want total government control of these platforms is why would this argument not be consistent across newspapers? Why couldn't I just say, well, we want total government control of newspapers? What's the difference here? Why is that analogy unapt? Or is it apt?
Well, I think that do you want the entire media Do I want the entire media to be nationalized? I don't. I think that would be. I think that would be a serious mistake. Um, Even though I also don't think we should exaggerate that necessarily. That I do think we have models of government owned or at least government funded and not exactly private owned media organizations that are not just outlets of state propaganda. I point to BBC, for example, as an instance of that. But I still wouldn't want
And
that to be the entire
newspapers.
media.
Oh, finish your point.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I do think that there is, but I do think that some of the same concerns that motivate it would totally go for for the media that having like a few corporations with with way too much influence over this that all of the cable news channels, I don't know, this is a dated statistic, it might not be true anymore, probably isn't true anymore, but that there was a time when there were 3 companies or something that between them controlled every single cable news channel. That is very troubling, and that even in general, having I mean, even if it was like a slightly wider array of plutocrats that that control all media, that I would find that troubling. But because of that difference between something that's a neutral platform in which anybody can come and say their thing versus something that has an editorial line, etc., I do think that the solution would be slightly different in that case. I don't think that having the government control the whole thing, the whole thing be nationalized would necessarily be the right thing to do. I think that you could also have. I think that you could have maybe maybe some of it be nationalized. I think you could have news cooperatives. That I think you probably do want an array of different media organizations that aren't all controlled by the same entities. I think that is useful. So the solution's different, but I do think that some of the same concerns that would motivate one solution would also motivate the other.
I mean, it's interesting for me in Australia because this is our big topic at the moment. Rupert Murdoch owns all of our media and is very much in support of our government. And our government-funded news station is having its funding cut because it is appropriately reporting on government actions. So it's not necessarily as clear-cut that a government-owned media outlet will not do the job of reporting honestly on the government, and it is not clear cut that independent media organizations can't use their influence to work with the government. I think I'd be interested in seeing at least an attempt at breaking them up. Or I think also it's important to understand that nationalizing, creating a public option isn't to say that it is just government controlled. Taking something and making a public option out of it means that you can break up ownership within that. And you can create other laws. Like, I mean, look at Amazon. If you created if Amazon was publicly owned, it's not just about what they can do with their data. It's about how they treat their workers, which is also important.
Yeah. And
why not leave them alone and just make our own government thing? Why do we have to like touch Twitter and Facebook? Just leave them alone and let's make our own.
I would also say that quickly that government owned, I think something when people hear government owned, they're like, okay, well, like the president gets to directly intervene in the editorial room. That's not necessarily the case. You could put it in a public trust, right? And have a separate body.
There's limits, Prime, because of recent our conservative court at action. So here I'll give a point to our people. But I mean, so one of the aspects of judicial review that we recently had was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the protection given to the head of that organization. And the conservative court said this level of protection is too much, and we should have a more unitary executive, and that's in the Constitution and the framers, whatever. So that's your judicial review at work, limiting the extent to which the president cannot have control of an agency. And so I'm worried about if Trump is in charge of news media, what happens to news media?
So yeah, reverse that shit. And then
well, Pisco. Part of the reason I would argue that we wouldn't create a government social media instead of breaking up or making a public option out of what already exists is that these big organizations already have more power than some actual nation states, given their reach, given how integrated they are into our lives. So it would be very difficult to have a public option that garnered as much power and influence as those that already exist to combat or even equalize that.
Yeah, I would also point out that even though I don't what an entirely nationalized media that I think Prime's point is a good one, and I don't think we should be too quick to to dismiss that it's not really, there's tons of stuff even in the federal government that Donald Trump does not have much in the way of direct personal control over, and there are also all sorts of possible structures for having some version of public ownership that don't necessarily give any particular elected official a lot of we have public libraries, but that doesn't mean that the mayor can walk up and down the shelves pulling books off and saying we can't stock this, we can't stock that, because that's in that's in the hands of a library board. And in fact, one advantage often of public ownership is those free speech protections. Now, this is a point to you on some of the judicial review stuff, because this is an example of the courts doing good, But when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, tried to fire Angela Davis from her job at the University of California for being a member of the Communist Party, and they stopped her because they said, no, you can't do that. You can't fire a public employee, for their political beliefs. Eventually, they came up with another pretext to fire her, but because that would violate the First Amendment. So I do think, even though I am kind of on your side, I think having an entirely nationalized media would be bad. But I'd also think that there's a general tendency in these arguments to overstate the degree to which particular decision makers like Trump can control anything that that's public. That oftentimes you have even things that are within the purview of the executive branch. You have all sorts of layers of bureaucracy there that do stop the president from just doing whatever they want with it.
So, and I'll say one last thing to double down on what Joe had said earlier, right? The reach of our national newspapers, and even our the cable news, right? The reach of those platforms, even at their absolute height, the zenith, has never come close to the reach of Facebook and the reach of Twitter, right? Those singular entities around the world. So I don't think they're exactly the same thing, having nationalizing one versus the other. Though I don't think we should, of course, nationalize all of media. But that out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, totally. I agree that there is a distinction here between a news company and a platform, a public platform like Facebook and Twitter. I agree that there are differences. One aspect that I am worried about government control of a wide majority of these platforms, precisely because the majoritarian tendencies of our government in years past are precisely what you all mentioned with respect to communism. We criticize the court for some of its bad rulings with respect to communism, but that pales in comparison to the public hearings that we're having at the time and McCarthyism in general and the public sentiment. So I'm worried about some of the dissidents on this platform and others who are more radical being labeled a pariah by the government and being shut down.
Well, but are you more worried about them being shut down by the government, or are you more worried about them being
I'm worried about both. I'm worried about both.
Because I do think both worries are legitimate, but if I had to pick, I'd be more worried about the second thing.
Joe?
Really?
And also what Prime mentioned, if you took a majority of ownership stakes in a tech company and you put them in an autonomous public trust and you diversified ownership between multiple stakeholders, representatives from workers, consumers, some government officials, and the general public, you're less likely to run into those concerns that you mentioned.
Who operates it, right? Who operates it? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to piggyback off of this idea that we give the workers and the public some degree of control over these companies rather than just making it, state operated, as it were, is that if you actually look with information that's come out now as to what kind of motivated Jack Dorsey into finally making the decision to remove Trump from Twitter, about 300 employees signed onto a letter that they were all going back and forth in Slack chat about, basically saying to him, hey, we're really uncomfortable with the situation that we're still allowing this guy to be on our platform. We've pretty much crafted the TOS for the last 4 years to allow him to remain on the platform by adjusting rules to accommodate him. And we are going to tell the public that that is how we feel about things unless you go ahead and remove him. So all I guess I'm saying is that as far as I can tell, employees are actually a little bit more concerned with the effect that these platforms are having than the CEOs, who at the end of the day have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and will only remove these people when it's going to hit them in the pocketbook.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm actually a little skeptical about how much the employee letter is really what tipped them over the edge. Honestly, like I think that I think that when employees are asking for things that that don't really violate the company's interests, or that they might have other reasons to do right now anyway, they're more like, I don't know. I'm a little leery about being too quick to see this as worker power. In
Yeah,
action,
no, I mean,
especially because everything else that was going on at the same time, right? Like, this is a point where the business community in general had just massively turned against Trump. The National Association of Manufacturers was telling Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment. So in that context, I think it's maybe not very surprising, even if you subtract the employee statement that they would finally deplatform Trump.
Did you have your
Inspector's
Yeah,
point is
no,
a good one.
like I said, it's obviously not lost on me that like they didn't make the decision to do it until, once again, it was going to affect them in the pocketbook, and their shareholders are like, hey, you probably should go ahead and do this. But that being said, I guess it's interesting to me that the worker, like, the impulse is there for the employees, I guess.
You're raising a great point, which is, to whom do you delegate the responsibility of making rules for these platforms? So one thing is, like, you could say, the workers make the rules, or you could say the government makes the rules, or the person, the trustee makes the rules for whatever trust it is. But you're going to have to sort of give to some actor rule-making authority over these platforms. And if that rule-making person with rule-making authority is the trustee, maybe he's answerable to the president, maybe not, or you have to give it somewhere. And so my question is,
yeah, but Pisco, if you have an issue with that,
there are probably a lot of answers to that question that might be okay. There are better and worse answers, but I think one of the very worst answers is that we just give it to a handful of extraordinarily rich people.
Yeah,
Joe?
If you have an issue with that the buck has to stop somewhere, you have an issue with democratic management structures generally. If I'm saying that an autonomous public trust is being set up and that it's made up of representatives from a variety of factions, and you're saying, well, who ultimately makes the rules? That's true of democracy at large.
Yeah. So that's why I always cite, like, the Federalist Papers and the founding, the framers, because one key insight, which I think still holds true, and maybe I'm naive in believing it, is power checking power and non-centralization of authority. Which is why if we think de facto that has already happened and it's in the hands of these elite oligarchs, maybe you're right. Maybe I give you props there, and we should be worried about that. But I wouldn't substitute one centralized autonomous group.
But it's not centralized.
I mean, the funny thing is here, I mean, whatever. I'm much less of a fan of the collection of aristocrats and bankers and slaveholders.
The insight, Ben.
But if you agree with the insight, then that goes with what's being suggested, because that sort of trustee system, would be based on having various stakeholders with some ability to check each other.
Perhaps so, but I want another outside. I think you agree with
Why?
this. So maybe I'm arguing against. I want private media as well, because I don't want to put all my eggs in the trust fund basket. Is that? And
I'm not suggesting that media should be. I'm not suggesting the entire media landscape should be government owned either. But I am questioning the validity of your argument, which I assume exists in your head, that a private media organization will always criticize the government more so than a government owned media organization will criticize the government. Yeah, because that's definitely not the case in my country.
Yeah, Rupert Murdoch, in our country, arguably state media, right? The Fox News of the world. So I hear those concerns, and I think that oftentimes interests converge between government actors, and essentially either government will co-opt and sort of agency capture the media or the other way around. So I think that those are genuine concerns.
So if your concern is that we need a fourth estate that's independently going to check the government, I don't necessarily think claiming that they need to be independently owned is the be all and end all for that argument. I think there are other factors that could come into play to keeping.
It's not perfect. Yeah. So any of these systems can be corrupted. Any government, if the people are bad enough. And I think my concern is just putting enough barriers, putting enough molasses, slowing down things so that whatever happens takes a longer process, and that will cause harm. It is conservative in one sense, but I think that I want us to change the Constitution in many ways. I want to get rid of the Electoral College. I want to institute some change that I'm sure people on this panel wouldn't consider radical, but other people in this country would consider radical. But unfortunately, I think one of the aspects of our government that has to exist to prevent it from becoming tyrannical is slowing down things and making things have to go through many checks before they sort of pass. But I'm sure there's skepticism about that on this panel.
Okay. I'm skeptical about things. First of all, Eucharist, did you have your hand up previously? I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I took notes because we covered like 6 different topics in this span. So there are a few things back that I thought were really interesting that I still want to talk about. So like the state funded options versus like state seizure of the things that we've already got. To me, that's like, yeah, sure, why not? Why not have a state funded option? Like we said, like there are examples of publicly funded media that do just fine, like BBC, NPR. Those are very different, I know, but like we can publicly fund media and it ends up being pretty good. And the reason why it ends up being pretty good in a lot of cases is because you're removing some of the incentive structures that these private media companies like Fox or private social media companies have in terms of just getting as many clicks and people on their website as possible for a profit motive. You just take that out of the equation and the quality changes, because like we've seen with Fox just in the past like 20 years, like there's a significant change in the kind of content that you're getting and the quality of the reporting that you're getting when they realize, oh yeah, we can just fish for clicks. And then you see the rise of the Breitbarts of the world. And I really liked Ben's reference to public libraries, because my favorite Vonnegut quote is like the America that I love still exists at like the front desks of public libraries and the little old ladies who refuse to give thought crime lists to the investigators. Like love that, right? So it's not like the state funds it so we have a clear path to surveillance. But Silly Serious, you mentioned privacy laws, like that would need to be like really robust for this to work. And like the problem is they already suck, at least in America. Like there's some pretty dismal research coming out, stuff that's just like on a rolling basis being declassified, stuff we're still learning through lawsuits about, just like, oh yeah, how awful it is that the government has this like extensive surveillance power.
Although,
so I think
it is interesting that the public, those librarians Vonnegut is talking about, were one of the most consistent sources of opposition to the Patriot Act. Whereas big tech was generally all too eager. You didn't have to ask them twice to turn over anybody's records.
Right. So it's not as if a private corporation is a really good check here. The problem is just that the structures that are in place, the government already has access to this stuff, even when they don't have a, let's say, closer legal connection to it than maybe the distance a corporation might provide. Like you said, it already sucks. Like the corporations are just like, here, have it. We're not even going to fight this really.
And I just add to, I guess, what Ben was saying. So they were so happy to jump in on this, right? Handing over people's information, right? Microsoft was a big offender of this. But also, even when they weren't, the few times they weren't, like that act that they had been so in favor of was like used against them when the government started tapping their lines. So like when the government started to spy on Google, literally tap their lines. It kind of just came right back at them. So go ahead.
What about Apple's lock thing? I mean, it's not always the case that they're in bed with federal law enforcement or local law.
Sure. Okay. So they're not always in bed, but like, then there's going to be differences across companies. There's going to be different norms and, companies do things different ways. But going to the incentive structure thing, and the reason why I'm kind of skeptical, I guess, at root about like a state funded social media platform is I just don't know who the hell's going to use it, because like the thing that makes social media so addicting for so many people is the exact thing that brings the company's profit, which is we're designing algorithms, and also the things that lead to the kind of extremist stuff that we've been seeing. We're building algorithms for the sake of driving people developed in kind of a frenzy. We're going to put them together in groups that are like them. Like I just don't. The way that most social media platforms work is I think just inherently harmful. I just hate social media in general as much as I'm addicted to it. And so I just don't see how you develop a successful and appealing social media platform without those negatives in a publicly funded way that anybody's going to want to use.
Well, I mean, I think that's a reason to nationalize or bring under some form of social ownership, social media companies and because if I mean, for the same, I mean, honestly, some of the same grounds that have been used historically for, for like state monopolies on things like gambling or liquor in some states, that we were leery about having dangerously addictive things be in the hands of private corporations. That if we can have that if the that yeah, I think one of the benefits of it, in fact, could be removing some of the incentives to and to I think if social media could be made less appealing, I think that would be better for the world in almost every way. Since I mean, if we could do if we could somehow like ask a genie to just eliminate social media so it wouldn't exist anymore, I think we'd probably be better off. But since we can't do that, and we don't want to get rid of it entirely, or it's just going to go underground. That I think having I think that to me that's a reason to have a publicly owned, one hopes much less addictive version.
Sure. So I mean, at least having a publicly owned option seems reasonable. Public ownership of what exists is like I'm not a socialist, so that like I like my soul just grates against it a little bit. So maybe it's good, but I guess I'm not convinced. But at least starting with breakups, right? So we talked about like antitrust law obviously isn't really working, but that's something that I always talk about. There does seem to be some movement on, and I think that's something that you could introduce some effective change. It does connect very well to our judicial review conversation. There's a change in the way that the court started thinking about antitrust law and what it means to harm a consumer and what's worth breaking up. It was pretty drastic, and it's Robert Bork's legal philosophy basically that changes it. So it's like you get this shift in really like the 80s where we're just reconceiving of what harm to the consumer means. And if we can walk back on some of that, get some legislation and reform, like that seems like at least a good place to start, that a lot of people on both sides are tending to agree with now.
Yes.
Sure, but Eucharist, the problem is that public utility regulation in the United States has shown that it's ineffective, not just in terms of breaking things up, but in terms of dealing with concentration of power and democratizing wealth and economic control and the rights of workers. Like there's innumerable problems with big tech that exist beyond antitrust laws or public utility regulations' ability to fix them.
So keep in mind, some of the biggest antitrust lawsuits in history have just been filed against Google for searches. And I think almost every state in America has sued Facebook for being a monopoly.
So I would say though, like I don't know that that's universal. I think you're right. Like, yes, there are more issues than just bust the trust and break them up. But like you look at like the economic consequences and the consequences in innovation and tech, and like the first AT&T bust up, for example, and it's like it's pretty good. It some things were helped, right? It's not a panacea. It doesn't fix everything, but it's certainly not a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
I want to answer Ben's question as well of the comparison to other public monopolies with like liquors and liquor licenses and the gambling stuff. I think one of the answers to that might be, well, yeah, and those things shouldn't exist. Like, gambling should be legal. And so, you should be able to. Now, that taken to the extreme would be an argument that we should never have any regulation. I think that's absurd. But I think some of those cases, maybe, we shouldn't have as much government control in those industries in terms of who's allowed to be a player.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't necessarily know why not. But I am curious about Eucharist's point about breaking up tech monopolies, because there might just be something I'm missing here, but I've never really been sold on what that would look like. The trust busting solution to social media monopolies, because if you think about something like Facebook, okay, sure, you could pry apart Facebook from Instagram, you could even pry apart Facebook from Facebook Messenger, but if all Facebook owned was Facebook, that that would still be a hell of a lot of control over the flow of information in the hands of one company.
And beyond that,
Right. So
and to beyond that, what Ben and what Joe were saying, like even if we like actually like break up Facebook into multiple smaller face pamphlets, that doesn't mean they won't actually all make the same decisions, right, in terms of censorship. So if there is an incident, right, like for instance, a leader, possibly instigating insurrection, and then like calling for more violence, possibly like on his account, it could be possible that those smaller companies would make all the same decisions. So like just like antitrust, just breaking something up doesn't necessarily solve that issue.
Well, and I really want to know what the face pamphlets look like, right? Like, do you have to worry like, okay, wait a second, I'm friends with this person on this face pamphlet, and, like I need to send a request to the other face pamphlet. Like it's always just struck me as a case where we're breaking up. Where breaking up seems a little impractical on the face of it.
They're useful because they're ubiquitous and everyone's on them.
Well, okay, so I'll say this quickly: is that like the structure of the internet, the way it is now, all these walled gardens, does not have to be. Right, like the internet was made to be interoperable, was made to be open. Right, we have these walled gardens because private industry decided, well, this is how we're going to make money. Right, so it's not the case that like the information from Facebook can't like go over to Google or I don't know, name some other or Twitter. Right, like these things can be perfectly interoperable. The degree that they're not is the degree that they make profit off of these walled gardens. So. Out there.
So I mean, in response to that, like so I see what you're saying. Antitrust law is about consumer interest dealing with the market, and so there's limited utility when we're dealing with like broader moral issues or political issues. Like we have a political norm of free speech. We want lefties and righties alike to be able to coalesce and have their movements, and also maybe punish people who are bad actors calling for horrible things, right? So like there are things beyond just like interests of consumers in a market environment that need to be addressed. But yeah, in terms of like just busting a trust, at least in a world where we're actually enforcing the laws that are on the books, Facebook doesn't acquire Instagram, Facebook doesn't acquire WhatsApp. That's a drastic consolidation of market share, market power. And so so just Facebook on its own is significant. But then imagine like what some people have talked about recently, and that's on the Google antitrust lawsuit right now, is like the coalescing power around not just Google and Google search results, but everything that they own, and then combine that with Google ads, right, is something that's an incredible source of power for them, that they magically win all of their ad buys. There's all these things in the lawsuit. So there are things that I think antitrust can address that are very, very important. Like, yeah, of course, it's not going to fix everything, but when you have an actually competitive environment, I do think that, we would have less fears about like, Facebook and Apple and Google just decided yesterday that they're going to ban all you lefties who are trying to organize your socialism. Like, that's bad, right? Like,
Joe?
I just have a question, and Americans might know more than me, but the California electricity trust busting, the PG&E, like how does that work in terms of like the trust laws sort of put you in a situation where you're both sort of for the public, but you still have a responsibility to your investors to make as much profit as possible. How are independent corporations meant to balance those needs? Like I think that's a shortcoming of antitrust laws, because you're playing to teams.
I don't know anything about antitrust or the example you're citing, but I do know that oftentimes government can institute a monopoly for like things like water and electricity in our country, and it can be a private company that the government has control over to like regulate and stuff, and they're allowed to have profits in certain areas but not others. They have to have price floors or ceilings or something. I don't know the details of it, but or what you're saying or about antitrust in general, but maybe that's what they're doing.
You mean like
go ahead.
I mean, I will say PG&E in particular is a pretty good advertisement for those kinds of private companies essentially being given monopolies, by the government for utility reasons, being very bad news if you look at their recent track record in California and like spending years never securing, power lines even after they cause multiple fires and, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that whether or not you think there are good solutions within allowing those sorts of monopolies for for private companies, the actual existing track record isn't very good.
Could you maybe
Right,
elaborate on the question? I'm just not. Oh, or sorry, Spectre, you can go. But I'm not.
I was just going to say, like, I'm intimately familiar with the case that Joe is referencing here because I live in California and obviously use electricity. So that being said, PG&E is an awful fucking monopoly. They basically preserve their profits by refusing to bury their lines, which leads to like an inordinate amount of fucking wildfires every summer. The utilities should just be handled by the government. There's no need to like give a company private monopolies like this. And the other thing about PG&E is due to the fact that they do have a private monopoly, they charge an insane amount as far as like kilowatt per hour. Like I used to be in the solar industry. I could sell you a solar system for double the price in California that I would charge in Wisconsin, not because of the fact that it's doing anything more of you, but just due to the fact that if you put it on financing, it's still fucking cheaper than paying your electric bill every month here.
It really is the worst of both worlds in a lot of ways, because if something is publicly owned, at least you have voice, that you have some theoretical control over it, over its policies, or maybe the people ultimately making decisions about its policies are worried of it. You'll get mad at them and you'll vote them out of office. And if something's private, then theoretically you're supposed to have exit, so you can just opt out, right? Oh, I'm gonna like stop using, I'm gonna stop, Burger King will be seeing no more of my business. It's just McDonald's from now on. But in this case, you have neither, right? So I think it's the most disenfranchised that power customers could possibly be.
So that's ultimately my concern with any sort of public regulation that isn't public ownership.
ISPs is a huge problem too. It's a problem in the country.
I was just thinking about other areas in which we do this here in the States, right? Because transportation is one of these things, right? We will give a private corporation a guaranteed monopoly. You'll see this like a corporation controlling the buses and the subway and all that, right? And why? Like, why would we have that? Like, why would they have a board of the profits? And I'm reminded just quickly about like Japan, which is interesting because like the Tokyo subway system has like 3 separate corporations that are running. And I'm so curious as to like how that works, like in terms of the corporate cooperation and the competition. But yes, there's 3 separate companies that run the Tokyo subway system. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think the conventional arguments are that one, private actors are just like better and more creative than public actors. I don't know if I agree with that. And the other is that like the profit incentive will reduce bloat and will reduce bureaucracy and waste. So you guys can assess for yourselves whether or not you buy those arguments. I'm not sure I do.
No.
Yeah, I do think though that like the issue of utilities and how we manage those, like you're saying, like it looks, I don't know much about the PG&E stuff, but it looks terrible, is a little bit different than how you handle like tech companies or markets in general. Because like what you were saying about how this relates to shareholders, that they have a fiduciary interest or responsibility towards. Like, I mean, the book I'm thinking of that I read recently was Tim Wu's Master Switch. He's a law professor. He does antitrust law and history of antitrust, and he tracks like the history of the first AT&T bust up, and actually it was good for investors on all sides of the divested company. So like it ends up being better for shareholders and better for consumers, and there's lots of benefits in the long run.
So Pisco, have you, with this conversation, have you moved at all on this?
On the regulation?
On breaking up big tech, or like limiting its power, or like giving it to, because we've given you a lot of options here.
Yeah. So I was concerned a little bit by what I saw, even though I can simultaneously say that Twitter probably should have banned Trump earlier, and their delay, if anything, shows how like their rules weren't functioning. If what their goal was to help outcomes, then clearly their rules didn't accomplish that. But I was glad, better late than never. And on like an immediate political level, it helped, but it concerned me as well. And so I think that you can regulate these companies. You don't have to ban them or nationalize them or do anything like that. You don't have to. You can regulate the ways in which they have their rules and how they apply them. You can also have a government alternative, which I think would be okay. These are things I've always sort of believed in and thought that they were okay. I've always been also concerned with censorship, and I think that concern, to be consistent, needs to be both applied to the government and to private actors. So what's moved me a lot on the need for it, I think, has been in recent days. But if you didn't see this kind of thing coming down the pipeline, I think you weren't paying attention to some of the smoke signals.
Okay.
But with respect to regulation, some of what's been proposed here, I think, makes a lot of sense. I'm not in favor of nationalizing the companies as such. I would be in favor of making an alternative.
What to Ben and Joe? What do you think of internationalizing Facebook? So rather than leaving it just like a publicly a U.S. government-backed trust, right? Rather something that's in international hands. Like, for instance, when we hand over the DNS servers, which are the backbone of the internet, the U.S. at first controlled these servers, and it was a big international consternation that we did. But then we handed over the keys internationally. What could we imagine a Facebook or Twitter that is held by, I don't know, some sort of UN-backed organization or something like that, or as part of the stakeholders? What do you think?
Well, I mean, for me, it's the biggest stumbling block, because if I'm arguing for a democratic, multi-stakeholder, multi-level sort of ownership and running of these big tech organizations, I have to take into account that this has to be global governance, and then it becomes a much more complicated endeavor. Look, the tech isn't my area. I don't have the answer for that at all. But I can acknowledge that any sort of venture into tech socialism would need to definitely take into account the global component. I don't know how.
Fair enough.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I guess I'm not sure. Having just heard the suggestion just now, but I think that's I think that having, I think having some sort of UN-like organization that, obviously the devil's in the details, but I'm not necessarily against that. I should also say, by the way, I'm not, I don't know. I mean, I understand it's a hard case, because he was obviously probably violating things that would be not only the actual terms of service, but almost any possible terms of service. But I'm not crazy about deplatforming Trump. I'm not sure what good that's going to do. And I kind of like the spirit of Will Menaker's suggestion on Chapo that whereas Trump does probably deserve to go to prison for the rest of his life, he should probably still be allowed to post while he's there.
So okay, but just lastly on that idea, I mean, you can just have a trust type situation. It doesn't have to be, again, that all nations are agreeing on how to run Facebook, right? We can have a separate organization specifically that can do these things. We've already done this in the tech space. Like, this is something that we've already done. So it's something that I think we can replicate again, possibly for social media, but just putting that out there. All right, so our good friend Ben Burgess here has limited time, so we'll have to end things here, unfortunately. But I think we're having a fantastic conversation. I think if we had more time, we could definitely cover other topics and have also robust discussions, but maybe for another time in the future.